It was a busy Tuesday morning at the downtown courthouse. People hurried past in suits, carrying briefcases and looking serious. Among all these professional-looking adults walked a teenager who stood out like a sore thumb. He wore a faded gray hoodie, old sneakers with worn-out laces, and carried a simple manila folder under his arm. His name was Jake Morrison, and he was just 18 years old. As Jake entered through the courthouse doors, heads turned. The security guards exchanged knowing glances. They had seen plenty of teenagers come through these doors before, usually in handcuffs or following behind worried parents. The kid didn't look like he belonged here. His hair was messy, his jeans had a small tear at the knee, and he walked with the casual gait of someone heading to a basketball court, not a legal proceeding. The marble floors echoed with the clicking of high heels and dress shoes, but Jake's sneakers made barely a sound. He walked past groups of lawyers huddled together, whispering about case strategies and exchanging business cards. Nobody gave him a second glance except to move out of his way, assuming he was lost or waiting for someone. In the main hallway, Jake stopped to check the large board listing all the day's court cases. His finger traced down the list until he found what he was looking for. Courtroom 3B, Morrison v. City Development Corp., 9:30 a.m. He glanced at the old clock on the wall. Perfect timing. The courtroom was already filling up when Jake entered. Lawyers in expensive suits sat behind polished tables, organizing thick stacks of documents. A few local residents sat in the gallery, probably there to observe the environmental case that had been in the news lately. The air smelled like old wood polish and coffee. Judge Barbara Henderson sat behind her imposing bench, her graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had been on the bench for 25 years and had a reputation for running a tight ship. People respected her, but they also feared her sharp tongue and quick temper. She didn't suffer fools gladly, and she especially didn't like her time wasted. As Jake walked down the aisle, a few people turned to look. The court reporter raised an eyebrow. The bailiff, a large man with kind eyes, watched the teenager with mild curiosity. Where were this kid's parents? Was he here for some family matter? Maybe he was a witness in a different case. Jake slid into a seat near the front, placing his folder on his lap. He pulled out a pen and started making notes on a legal pad, his handwriting surprisingly neat. The lawyers around him continued their conversations, completely ignoring his presence. To them, he was just background noise, another face in the crowd. The opposing counsel team was impressive. 3 lawyers from Sterling and Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms. They wore suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Their leather briefcases were monogrammed, their shoes shined to a mirror finish. They moved with the confidence of people who had won hundreds of cases before. Lead counsel for the defense was a woman in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and reading glasses hanging from a gold chain. She sorted through documents with practiced efficiency, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to her colleagues. They nodded and took notes, clearly preparing for what they expected to be a routine victory. The clock ticked toward 9:30. Judge Henderson shuffled papers on her desk, preparing to call the court to order. The bailiff stood ready to announce the first case. Jake sat quietly, his folder now open in front of him, revealing pages filled with highlighted text and handwritten notes in the margins. Around him, the courtroom buzzed with quiet energy. Lawyers checked their phones one last time before the proceedings began. The court reporter flexed her fingers, preparing for hours of typing. In the gallery, spectators settled into their seats, some opening notebooks to take their own notes. Jake looked up at the judge's bench, then at the defense table where the Sterling and Associates team sat confidently. He took a deep breath and checked his watch. Almost time. His heart beat a little faster, but his hands remained steady. This was it. Everything he had worked for, all those late nights studying, all those years of preparation, had led to this moment. The judge cleared her throat and a hush fell over the courtroom. Nobody noticed the teenager with the manila folder sit up a little straighter in his seat. The bailiff's deep voice echoed through the courtroom. Morrison versus City Development Corporation. His words bounced off the wooden walls as everyone prepared for the first case of the day. The lawyers from Sterling and Associates straightened their papers and checked their watches, expecting to see an experienced attorney approach the plaintiff's table. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. The teenager in the hoodie stood up. Not partially, not halfway, but fully stood up and began walking toward the front of the courtroom. His sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor with each step. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with quiet professional energy, suddenly went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Every head turned to watch this kid walk down the aisle. The lawyers looked at each other with raised eyebrows. The court reporter paused her typing, her fingers hovering over the keys. Even the bailiff, who had seen everything in his 20 years on the job, looked confused. Jake walked past the defense table where the Sterling and Associates team sat with their mouths slightly open. He didn't make eye contact, just kept walking with steady steps toward the plaintiff's table on the other side of the room. His manila folder was tucked under his arm, and his casual clothes seemed even more out of place in the formal setting. The murmuring started low, like the sound of bees in a hive. "What's he doing?" whispered someone in the gallery. "Is that kid lost?" said another voice, louder this time. The confusion spread through the room like wildfire. Lawyers leaned toward each other, sharing puzzled looks and hushed comments. Judge Henderson watched this scene unfold with growing irritation. Her fingers tapped against her wooden gavel. She had seen plenty of strange things in her career, but a teenager approaching the plaintiff's table in a major civil case was definitely a first. Her expression hardened, and her famous no-nonsense attitude kicked into high gear. Jake reached the plaintiff's table and set down his folder. He pulled out the chair and sat down, completely calm despite all the eyes on him. He opened his folder and started arranging his papers, acting as if nothing unusual was happening. The rustling of paper was the only sound in the otherwise silent courtroom. That's when Judge Henderson had enough. She leaned forward, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, and fixed the teenager with a stern look. Her voice carried a sharp edge of sarcasm that everyone in the courtroom recognized. "Young man," she said, drawing out each word for emphasis, "are you perhaps looking for juvenile court? Because this is a civil litigation matter, not a high school mock trial competition." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Several lawyers chuckled quietly, thinking the judge had nailed it perfectly. The kid was obviously lost, maybe looking for his mother or father who was involved in some other case. Someone in the gallery laughed outright, quickly covering it with a cough. Jake looked up from his papers, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. His young face showed no embarrassment, no panic, no sign of being out of place. If anything, he seemed perfectly at ease. This caught Judge Henderson off guard for a moment. Most teenagers would have turned red and mumbled an apology by now. The defense team at Sterling and Associates exchanged smug glances. The lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman with years of experience, whispered something to her colleagues, who nodded, in agreement. They were probably discussing how to handle this interruption without wasting too much of the court's time. The courtroom remained frozen in this moment of awkward tension. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Would the teenager finally realize his mistake and scurry out of the room? Would security escort him to wherever he was supposed to be? The bailiff took a small step forward, ready to intervene if needed. Jake slowly reached into his folder and pulled out a single document. He held it up so the judge could see it clearly. The paper looked official, with a seal and formal letterhead visible even from a distance. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and clear, carrying across the silent courtroom. The next words out of his mouth would shock everyone in the room and change the entire trajectory of the case. But for now, the courtroom remained suspended, in that moment of confusion and anticipation, waiting to see what this unexpected visitor would do next. Jake stood up slowly, holding the document in his hand. The silence in the courtroom was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every eye in the room was focused on him, waiting to see how this awkward situation would play out. The teenager's voice cut through the quiet like a bell. "Your Honor, my name is Jake Morrison. I am the lead attorney representing the plaintiffs in this case." His voice was steady, no trembling or uncertainty. He spoke like someone who had done this 100 times before, not like a nervous kid who had wandered into the wrong room. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The defense lawyer's jaws literally dropped. One of them nearly knocked over his coffee cup. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keyboard, her eyes wide with disbelief. Judge Henderson blinked several times as if trying to clear her vision. She leaned forward in her chair, gripping the edge of her bench. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" Jake reached back into his folder and pulled out another document, this one in a plastic sleeve for protection. He walked forward and handed it to the bailiff, who looked just as shocked as everyone else. "My bar certification, Your Honor. You'll find everything is in order." The bailiff, moving almost in slow motion, carried the document to Judge Henderson. The room watched in complete silence as she took it, her expression a mix of confusion and growing skepticism. She put on her reading glasses and began examining the paper carefully, her eyes scanning every line. At the defense table, the lead attorney whispered urgently to her team. They huddled together, their previous confidence melting into bewilderment. One of them pulled out his phone, probably to Google whether this was even legal. Another kept staring at Jake like he was seeing a ghost. The seconds ticked by like hours as Judge Henderson read. Her expression changed gradually, moving from disbelief to surprise to something that looked almost like shock. She turned the document over, checking the back. She held it up to the light as if making sure it wasn't a fake. Finally, she looked up at Jake, then back down at the certification, then up at Jake again. "This appears to be legitimate," she said slowly, her voice carrying a hint of disbelief. "But you're just a child." "I'm 18, Your Honor," Jake replied calmly. "I passed the bar exam 3 months ago. Everything is properly filed with the State Bar Association. If you'd like to verify, I can provide additional documentation." The courtroom erupted in whispers. People leaned toward each other, sharing their shock and confusion. The defense team looked like they'd been hit by a truck. The gallery buzzed with energy as spectators tried to process what they were seeing. Judge Henderson handed the certification back to the bailiff and sat back in her chair. For a long moment, she just stared at Jake, her professional mask slipping, slightly. Here was a kid who looked like he should be in high school debate class standing in her courtroom claiming to be a fully licensed attorney. Finally, she shook her head slowly, a sardonic smile creeping across her face. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "this should certainly be entertaining." The room held its breath, waiting for her next words. "Tell me, counselor," she continued, emphasizing the last word with obvious mockery. "Do you think you can keep up with the grown-ups? Or should we perhaps call your parents to come pick you up?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The defense lawyers smirked, some of their confidence returning. They had recovered from the initial shock and were now treating this like an amusing sideshow. Jake remained perfectly composed. He didn't blush, didn't stammer, didn't show any sign of being rattled by the judge's tone. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "I'm ready to proceed, Your Honor." The bailiff returned to his position, still looking stunned. The court reporter poised her fingers over the keyboard, ready to document whatever came next. Judge Henderson picked up her gavel, weighing it in her hand as she continued to study Jake. "Very well, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice still carrying that edge of disbelief. "Let's see what you've got. Please present your opening statement." Jake turned toward the jury box, which was still empty since this was a bench trial, then faced the judge directly. He opened his folder and began to speak, his voice clear and confident. What happened next would shock everyone in that courtroom even more than his unexpected appearance had. Jake opened his folder and pulled out a single sheet of notes. He didn't need a thick stack of papers or fancy presentations. He glanced at his notes once, then placed them face down on the table. Standing in the center of the courtroom, he began to speak without looking at any documents. "Your Honor, this case is about a neighborhood that trusted the wrong people." His voice was clear and strong, carrying easily to every corner of the room. "For the past 2 years, City Development Corporation has been dumping toxic waste into Riverdale Creek. They did it at night. They did it in secret, and they thought nobody would notice." The defense team exchanged glances, their smirks growing wider. The lead attorney leaned back in her expensive chair, watching Jake with amused eyes. She had heard opening statements from rookies before, and this kid was about to learn how real courtroom battles worked. Jake continued, his voice gaining momentum, but someone did notice. Mrs. Chen, who lives 3 blocks from the creek, started getting terrible headaches. Her daughter's asthma got worse. Their dog got sick. Then their neighbors' children started having the same problems. He walked to the side of the courtroom, pointing to an area map taped to the wall. Nobody had seen him put it there, but it was perfectly positioned for everyone to see. This creek feeds into the city's water system. The toxic chemicals didn't just stay in one place, they spread. The defense attorney scribbled something on a notepad and slid it to her colleague. He read it and chuckled quietly. They were probably joking about how the kid was giving a dramatic speech instead of presenting real evidence. The corporation tried to cover it up, Jake went on, his young face serious. They bribed the night security guard at the construction site. They falsified environmental reports. When residents complained, they offered them money to stay quiet. Judge Henderson listened with growing interest. She had presided over hundreds of environmental cases, but there was something different about how this teenager was presenting the facts. He wasn't just reading from a script or reciting legal arguments. He was telling a story. At the defense table, the team's confidence was unshakable. The lead attorney finally spoke up, her voice smooth and professional. Your Honor, while Mr. Morrison tells a compelling story, I don't see any evidence being presented. Where are the documented complaints, the environmental studies, the witness statements? The courtroom murmured in agreement. Several people nodded, thinking the experienced lawyer had a good point. Jake was just a kid telling stories, not a real attorney presenting a case. Jake turned to face the defense table directly. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or an uncertain one. It was the smile of someone who knew something others didn't. I'm glad you asked, he said simply. He walked back to his table and opened his manila folder completely. Inside were dozens of documents, photographs, and charts, all perfectly organized. He pulled out a thick stack of papers and held them up. These are the documented complaints you mentioned. 47 residents filed reports with the city health department. Here are the dates, times, and exact symptoms experienced by each family. He set the papers down and picked up another stack. These are the environmental test results from 3 independent laboratories, showing toxic levels far above legal limits. The defense team's smirks began to fade. The lead attorney sat up straighter, her casual demeanor shifting to something more alert. Jake's voice grew stronger. Here are bank records showing payments from city development to security guard Tom Williams on the exact nights when illegal dumping occurred. Here are emails between company executives discussing how to hide the contamination. And here is video footage from a resident's home security camera, showing dump trucks at the site. At 2 a.m. on multiple occasions, the courtroom was completely silent now. Even the judge leaned forward, clearly impressed by the organization and thoroughness of Jake's evidence. The defense team frantically whispered among themselves, their confidence evaporating like morning mist, but Jake wasn't finished. He picked up one more document, holding it high for everyone to see. Most importantly, we have this internal company memo written by the CEO himself, acknowledging the illegal dumping and ordering staff to continue operations regardless of health risks. The lead defense attorney's face went pale. She reached for her phone, probably to call her office for backup. This wasn't the easy case against an inexperienced kid that she had expected. Jake set the memo down and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. City Development Corporation knowingly poisoned an entire neighborhood to save money on proper waste disposal. They put profits over people's health, and they thought they could get away with it. Judge Henderson's expression had completely changed. The mocking tone from earlier was gone, replaced by the focused attention of a judge who realized this case was far more serious than it initially appeared. Mr. Morrison, she said slowly, please proceed with presenting your evidence. The real battle was just beginning. Jake moved toward the evidence table with the confidence of someone who had prepared for months. He picked up a thick binder and opened it to a specific page, as if he knew exactly where everything was without looking. Your Honor, I'd like to reference the 1976 case of Environmental Protection Agency versus Riverside Industries. The defense attorney shot up from her chair. Objection, that case was overturned in 1983 and is no longer relevant. Jake didn't miss a beat. Actually, while the main decision was overturned, the environmental impact standards established in that case were upheld and strengthened by the Supreme Court in Mitchell versus Green Valley in 1987. These standards directly apply to our case. Judge Henderson raised an eyebrow and looked at the defense table. He's correct. The objection is overruled. Continue, Mr. Morrison. The lead defense attorney sat down heavily, her expression showing the first cracks of concern. Her colleagues huddled around her, whispering urgently. This kid wasn't just throwing around random legal terms. He actually knew what he was talking about. Jake continued, his voice steady and clear. According to Section 4.2 of the Toxic Waste Management Act of 1994, any company that knowingly disposes of hazardous materials near residential areas faces penalties ranging from, he paused, then recited from memory, $50,000 to $500,000 per violation, plus mandatory cleanup costs. The courtroom listened in stunned silence. Nobody was checking their phones or fidgeting in their seats anymore. Even the bailiff, who usually stood stone-faced during proceedings, was watching Jake with obvious interest. Furthermore, Jake said, walking to a whiteboard that had been set up near the wall, the company's own safety protocols, as outlined in their 2022 employee handbook, state that all toxic materials must be disposed of at licensed facilities, at least 30 miles from any water source. He drew a quick map on the whiteboard, his hand moving with practiced ease. Riverdale Creek is less than 2 miles from their disposal site. They violated their own rules, not just environmental law. The defense team's second attorney stood up. Your Honor, we need to object to this line of reasoning. Internal company policies don't override state regulations. Jake turned to face him directly. You're absolutely right, they don't override them, they supplement them. When a company establishes stricter internal standards than required by law, they become legally bound to follow them. This principle was established in Corporate Accountability versus State of California, 2003. Judge Henderson's expression had completely transformed. Gone was the amused skepticism from earlier. She now leaned forward, taking notes as Jake spoke. The objection is overruled. Please continue with your argument, counselor. The word counselor hit differently this time. There was no mocking tone, no sarcasm. She was treating Jake like a real attorney now. Jake moved to his evidence table and picked up a manila envelope. Your Honor, I have a piece of evidence that came to light just yesterday. May I present it to the court? Proceed. Jake opened the envelope and held up several photographs. These pictures were taken by a private investigator hired by the residents. They show city development trucks making unauthorized visits to the disposal site after business hours. He passed copies to both the judge and the defense team. The HFY lead defense attorney's face went from concern to genuine worry as she examined the photos. Jake could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how he had obtained this evidence. Notice the license plates in these photos, Jake pointed out. Each truck is registered to City Development Corporation. And notice the timestamps, all after 11 p.m., well outside their permitted disposal hours. The defense attorney jumped up again. Objection, these photos could be doctored. There's no way to verify their authenticity. Jake smiled slightly. I anticipated that concern. He pulled out another document. This is an affidavit from the photographer, along with the original digital files showing the metadata, including exact time, date, and GPS coordinates. All of this has already been verified by an independent forensic analyst, whose report I'm submitting as Exhibit K. Judge Henderson's jaw tightened as she examined the new evidence. Mr. Morrison, this is highly unusual. Why wasn't this evidence presented during discovery? Your Honor, the residents only hired the private investigator last week. When they learned about this court case, they didn't have the resources before then. However, all evidence was shared with opposing counsel as soon as we received it, in compliance with discovery rules. The defense team looked like they were scrambling to keep up. Their lead attorney was frantically making phone calls while her colleagues whispered urgently. Their earlier confidence had evaporated completely. Jake continued his presentation, moving seamlessly between legal precedents, environmental regulations, and hard evidence. With each point he made, the case against city development grew stronger, and the defense's position weakened. By the time he finished his presentation, even the most experienced lawyers in the room were looking at him with newfound respect. Judge Henderson sat back in her chair, staring at Jake for a long moment. "Mr. Morrison," she said finally, "that was impressive." The courtroom remained silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The defense's turn came, and their first witness took the stand. Robert Kim, the company's environmental safety manager, was a middle-aged man in a crisp suit who looked like he'd testified in court before. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The lead defense attorney stepped forward, trying to regain some control. "Mr. Kim, can you please tell the court about your company's environmental protocols?" Kim nodded confidently. "Our company follows all federal and state regulations. We have weekly inspections, monthly safety meetings, and quarterly environmental audits. Everything is documented." Jake sat quietly at his table, making notes on a yellow legal pad. He didn't interrupt or object, just listened carefully to every word. "Thank you, Mr. Kim," the defense attorney said with a smile. "Your witness, Mr. Morrison." Jake stood up and walked slowly toward the witness stand. He carried only his yellow pad, leaving all his documents behind. The courtroom held its breath. "Mr. Kim," Jake began politely, "you mentioned weekly inspections. Who conducts these inspections?" "Our internal safety team," Kim replied. "And these inspections are documented?" "Yes, of course." Jake nodded and walked back to his table. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and returned to the witness. "Mr. Kim, this is an inspection report from June 15th. Can you read the signature at the bottom?" Kim squinted at the paper. That's my signature." "Yes, it is." "Now, can you tell me where you were on June 15th? Kim's confidence wavered, slightly. I'm not sure. That was several months ago." Jake pulled out his phone and showed it to the judge. "Your Honor, I have Mr. Kim's own social media post from June 15th. He was in Miami, Florida at a conference. The post shows him at the beach at the exact time this inspection was supposedly conducted." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Kim's face turned red. The defense attorney shot up from her chair. "Objection. Social media posts aren't reliable evidence." Jake remained calm. "Your Honor, I also have hotel receipts, flight records, and conference registration confirming Mr. Kim's location. Would you like to see them?" Judge Henderson looked at Kim sternly. "The witness will explain how he signed a document in two places at once." Kim stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. Sometimes I pre-sign documents when I know I'll be out of the office." "So these inspection reports were pre-signed?" Jake asked. "Before any actual inspection took place?" "Well, that's not exactly." Jake turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this calls into question all of the company's inspection reports. How many were pre-signed? How many actual inspections were performed?" The defense attorney requested a sidebar, and both lawyers approached the judge's bench. Their whispered conversation was heated, with hand gestures and frustrated expressions. When they returned, the defense called their next witness, Dr. Patricia Wong, an environmental scientist, who had prepared a report for city development. Dr. Wong took the stand with confidence. "Based on my analysis, the chemical levels in Riverdale Creek are within acceptable ranges." Jake smiled slightly as he approached the witness stand. "Dr. Wong, your report is dated September 12th. When did you actually collect the water samples?" "On September 10th, and the testing was completed when?" "September 11th. Jake nodded and walked to his table. He retrieved a calendar and showed it to the witness. "Dr. Wong, September 11th was a Sunday. Your laboratory's website clearly states they're closed on Sundays. How did you complete testing on a day when your lab was closed?" Dr. Wong's confident expression cracked. I may have mixed up the dates. Let me help you, Jake said gently. He pulled out a folder. These are the actual lab records from your testing facility. They show no samples were processed on September 11th, 12th, or 13th. The earliest tests were conducted on September 14th, 3 days after the deadline for submitting your report to this court. Judge Henderson leaned forward. Are you saying this report was submitted before the tests were even completed? Jake nodded. Your Honor, I believe the report was prepared to meet a deadline, not to present accurate findings. The defense team was now frantically whispering among themselves. Their lead attorney stood up again. Your Honor, we need to request a recess to review these allegations. Jake wasn't finished, though. Dr. Wong, can you tell me the chemical composition of the primary toxin found in your samples? It was, benzene compound, 47B. Jake's eyes lit up. There's no such thing as benzene compound 47B. The technical name you're looking for is 1,2-dichloroethane, which is completely different and far more dangerous. The courtroom gasped. Dr. Wong's face went white as she realized her mistake. Jake continued, his voice clear and professional. Dr. Wong, have you ever testified in an environmental case before today? No, I haven't. Yet you presented yourself as an expert witness. Can you tell the court about your qualifications in toxicology? I have a PhD in environmental science. That's impressive. But environmental science and toxicology are different fields, aren't they? Your expertise is in watershed management, correct? Not toxic chemical analysis? The defense attorney was on her feet again. Objection, the witness's qualifications speak for themselves. Judge Henderson sustained the objection, but the damage was done. Jake had exposed that the expert witness wasn't actually an expert in the relevant field. As the cross-examination continued, Jake methodically dismantled each piece of the defense's case. He caught another witness mixing up dates in their testimony. He revealed discrepancies in the company's financial records. Most impressive of all, he quoted case law from memory, referencing specific page numbers and amendments without ever looking at his notes. The defense requested 3 more sidebars during the examination, each time looking more desperate than the last. Their carefully constructed case was falling apart, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. By the end of Jake's cross-examination, even the most skeptical observers had to admit they were watching something extraordinary. Judge Henderson called for a recess after Jake's devastating cross-examination. As people filed out of the courtroom, whispers filled the air. Who was this teenager? Where did he come from? The defense team huddled in a corner, their phones pressed to their ears, desperately trying to find out everything they could about Jake Morrison. In the hallway, a local news reporter named Linda Chen approached Jake as he walked to the water fountain. Excuse me, Mr. Morrison. Could I ask you a few questions? People are wondering how someone so young can represent such a complex case. Jake smiled and took a sip of water. I understand the confusion. I get that a lot. Another reporter joined them, followed by curious lawyers who had been watching the proceedings. Soon a small crowd gathered around Jake, all wanting to know his story. How old are you? Someone asked from the crowd. 18. Jake replied simply. But you said you passed the bar exam 3 months ago. How is that possible? Jake leaned against the wall, his casual demeanor a stark contrast to the formal setting. I graduated high school when I was 14. It wasn't that I was necessarily smarter than everyone else, I just learned things faster. My parents noticed when I was 5 that I could read college-level books. The crowd listened intently as Jake continued his story. Some kids play video games. I read law books. I found them fascinating. By the time I was 12, I was attending college classes online. The professors didn't know how old I was, which helped. Some people treat you differently when they know you're young. Is that why you dress so casually? Linda asked. Jake grinned. Exactly. Today was strategic. I knew the defense team would underestimate me if I looked like a regular teenager. It gave me an advantage. They spent so much time being amused that they didn't prepare properly. A veteran lawyer who had been watching the trial chimed in. But why environmental law? Most young lawyers go for corporate law or criminal defense. The money's better. Jake's expression grew serious. When I was 16, my younger sister nearly died from drinking contaminated water during a camping trip. We later found out a company had been illegally dumping toxic waste upstream. No one was held accountable because the legal fees were too expensive for the affected families. The crowd listened in respectful silence as Jake continued. I decided that day I would become an environmental lawyer. Not for the money, but to help people who couldn't afford big law firms. I studied every environmental law case I could find. I memorized regulations. I learned how companies try to hide their mistakes. So your hoodie and sneakers, the reporter prompted. Are my normal clothes, Jake finished. But they also serve a purpose in court. People see what they expect to see. When they see a teenager in casual clothes, they assume I'm not prepared. Meanwhile, I've spent 4 years preparing for exactly this type of case. An elderly woman who had been sitting in the gallery approached the group. I live in Riverdale. My grandchildren play near that creek. Thank you for taking our case seriously. Jake's expression softened. That's why I do this, Mrs. Just call me Betty. My Tommy had asthma attacks every night for months. We couldn't figure out why until someone tested the water. Jake nodded solemnly. Cases like yours are why I chose this profession. Big companies have teams of expensive lawyers. Communities like Riverdale deserve strong representation too. Back inside the courtroom, the judge noticed the crowd gathering around Jake. She had seen many talented young lawyers over the years, but nothing quite like this. She picked up Jake's bar certification again, studying it more carefully this time. Her clerk, an older woman who had worked in the courthouse for decades, peered over her shoulder. Judge, I've been doing some research during the recess. This kid is the real deal. Graduated summa cum laude from law school. Youngest person to pass the state bar in over 50 years. Judge Henderson nodded slowly. I've been practicing law for 30 years. I've seen thousands of opening arguments. What that boy did today, most seasoned attorneys couldn't pull that off. When the recess ended and everyone returned to their seats, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The casual murmuring had been replaced by respectful silence. People looked at Jake differently now, with recognition rather than confusion. Jake took his seat at the plaintiff's table, opening his manila folder with the same calm movements as before, but now everyone understood that beneath the casual exterior was a brilliant legal mind that had already spent years mastering the complexities of environmental law. The defense team looked pale and worried. They had come prepared to face a community lawyer, maybe a recent graduate trying to make a name. Instead, they were dealing with someone who had dedicated his entire adolescence to becoming an expert in exactly the type of law they needed to defend against. Judge Henderson picked up her gavel, ready to continue the proceedings. As she looked out over the courtroom, she realized this case would become something special. A perfect storm of justice, where preparation met opportunity, and age proved to be just a number. Judge Henderson sat at her bench, her reading glasses perched on her nose, reviewing the stack of evidence before her. The courtroom was completely silent as everyone waited for her decision. Jake sat calmly at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded on top of his manila folder. The defense team fidgeted nervously, their earlier confidence completely gone. Finally, the judge removed her glasses and looked out over the courtroom. In my 25 years on this bench, I have presided over hundreds of cases. I have seen countless attorneys present their arguments, some brilliant, others less so. Today I witnessed something truly exceptional. Her gaze moved to Jake. When Mr. Morrison first entered this courtroom, I'll admit I made assumptions based on his appearance and age. I was wrong to do so, and I apologize for my initial remarks. The courtroom remained perfectly still, everyone hanging on her every word. The evidence presented today is overwhelming. City Development Corporation knowingly and deliberately violated environmental regulations. They endangered the health of an entire community. They attempted to cover up their actions through forgery, bribery, and deception. Judge Henderson's voice grew stronger, more assertive. Mr. Morrison has proven each element of this case beyond any reasonable doubt. The scientific evidence, the documentation, the witness testimonies, everything points to a clear pattern of corporate negligence and criminal behavior. She looked directly at the defense team, her expression stern. Sterling and Associates, your defense fell short not because of lack of skill, but because the facts were undeniable. When confronted with truth and thorough preparation, even the most expensive legal representation cannot prevail. Turning back to Jake, the judge's expression softened slightly. Mr. Morrison, your presentation today was masterful. Your knowledge of environmental law, your methodical approach to cross-examination, and your passion for justice are commendable. This court has rarely seen such comprehensive preparation and legal insight. She picked up her gavel, holding it high. Therefore, this court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. City Development Corporation is ordered to immediately cease all dumping activities, pay for complete environmental cleanup of Riverdale Creek, compensate affected residents for medical expenses, and pay a fine of $2 million to the State Environmental Protection Fund. The gavel came down with a resounding thud. For a moment, the courtroom remained silent as if everyone was processing what had just happened. Then, like a dam breaking, the emotions burst forth. Mrs. Betty, the elderly woman who had spoken to Jake during recess, began crying tears of relief. Her neighbors hugged each other. The residents of Riverdale who had packed the gallery began applauding. What started as scattered claps quickly grew into thunderous applause that filled the entire courtroom. Jake sat quietly for a moment, letting the reality sink in. Then he stood and turned to the gallery, nodding his appreciation. He didn't pump his fist or celebrate dramatically. He simply accepted the gratitude of the people he had fought for. Judge Henderson made no effort to quiet the applause. She watched the scene unfold with a slight smile, understanding that this was a moment these people needed. At the defense table, the Sterling and Associates team was packing up their briefcases, their faces a mixture of surprise and respect. The EAOE lead attorney whispered something to her colleagues, then stood up and walked toward Jake. "Mr. Morrison," she said, extending her hand. "Congratulations. That was extraordinary." Jake shook her hand. "Thank you. You presented a strong defense, given the circumstances." She smiled ruefully. "Not strong enough. Listen, I hope there are no hard feelings. We were just doing our job defending our client. Of course, that's how the system works." The attorney paused, then reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "I know you probably have your own plans, but Sterling and Associates would be honored to offer you a position. Starting salary would be, well, considerably more than most new attorneys make. We could use someone with your skills and dedication." Jake took the card politely but smiled. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm happy with my current path. Environmental justice cases like this are where I belong." Two more defense attorneys approached, also offering business cards and networking opportunities. Word was already spreading through the legal community about the 18-year-old who had just dismantled one of the city's most prestigious law firms. As the courtroom began to empty, residents from Riverdale surrounded Jake, thanking him, shaking his hand, some even asking for photos. Mrs. Betty pressed a handmade pie into his hands, insisting he take it. "You gave us our voice back," she said tearfully. "We thought nobody would listen to us little people." Jake accepted the pie gratefully. Everyone deserves to be heard, especially when their health and community are at stake. The bailiff approached, smiling for the first time all day. "Kid, I've been working here for 20 years. I've never seen anything like what you did today." Jake gathered his papers and his manila folder, the same one he had carried in hours earlier, looking like a lost teenager. Now as he walked out of the courtroom, he carried himself like the accomplished attorney he truly was. Judge Henderson watched from her bench as Jake left, surrounded by grateful residents. She made a mental note to follow this young lawyer's career. Something told her he would change the legal landscape in ways nobody could yet imagine. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the impact of what had happened there would resonate for years to come. A teenager had challenged the system and proven that sometimes the most powerful arguments come from the most unexpected sources. Jake stepped out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun, still carrying Mrs. Betty's pie in one hand and his manila folder in the other. Before he could even reach the steps, his phone started ringing. He glanced at the screen and sighed. It was the 5th call in the last 10 minutes. Morrison Law Office, he answered, trying to sound professional despite standing on the courthouse steps in his hoodie and sneakers. Mr. Morrison, this is David Bradley from Bradley & Associates. We represent Fortune 500 companies across the country. We caught wind of your performance today, and we'd like to offer you a position starting at $300,000 a year, plus bonuses. Jake shifted the pie to his other hand. That's very generous, Mr. Bradley, but I'm happy with my current practice. We're talking about corporate environmental law. Big cases, big clients, big money. You could make a real impact. I'm making an impact, Jake replied politely, just in a different way. Thank you for calling. He ended the call and immediately another one came in. This pattern continued for the next hour as Jake walked slowly toward his beat-up Honda Civic, parked 3 blocks away. By the time he reached his car, he had received 17 calls from various law firms, each offering increasingly impressive packages. His phone buzzed with a text from Judge Henderson. Exceptional work today. Would you like to discuss mentorship opportunities? Call me at your convenience. Jake smiled at the message. During the trial, the judge had gone from mocking him to respecting him, and now she was offering to help guide his career. He made a mental note to call her tomorrow when things calmed down. As he drove home to his small apartment, Jake thought about all the offers he'd declined. Sure, the money would have been nice. He could afford a better car, a nicer place, maybe even start paying off his student loans faster. But that wasn't why he became a lawyer. His phone rang again. This time it was his mom. Jake, I just heard from Mrs. Chen next door. The news is already spreading about what you did. I'm so proud of you. Thanks, Mom. It was a team effort. The residents did most of the hard work gathering evidence. Don't be modest. You've been working toward this since you were 12 years old. After hanging up, Jake's thoughts drifted to his sister, the one who had gotten sick from contaminated water years ago. She was away at college now, studying environmental science. He pulled over to text her the good news. 3 months later, Jake's office, a small room above a local coffee shop, looked the same as it always had. Second-hand furniture, stacks of case files, and a single plant that somehow survived despite his lack of gardening skills. But the phone never stopped ringing anymore. Morrison Law, he answered one Tuesday morning. Hi, this is calling from a neighborhood near the old industrial district. We think there's something wrong with our water again. Can you help us? I'll be right there, Jake said, already reaching for his car keys. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Henderson was speaking at a legal conference. I want to tell you about a case that changed my perspective on how we evaluate talent in the legal profession, she began, addressing a room full of judges and senior attorneys. She went on to describe the Morrison v. City Development case, emphasizing not just Jake's age, but his exceptional preparation, legal knowledge, and dedication to justice. This experience taught me never to judge a lawyer by their appearance or age. Sometimes the most powerful arguments come from the most unexpected places. Her speech would later be published in several legal journals and would influence hiring practices at law firms across the state. She continued to mentor Jake, meeting with him monthly to discuss complex cases and career decisions. The Morrison v. City Development case itself became a landmark decision. Law schools began using it as a case study, not just for its environmental law implications, but for its demonstration that thorough preparation could overcome any disadvantage. The case was cited in 12 subsequent environmental cases over the next year alone. 1 year after the trial, Jake received a letter in the mail. It was from a prestigious legal journal, informing him that their readers had voted the Morrison case as one of the top 10 most significant environmental law decisions of the decade. Jake pinned the letter to his office wall, right next to a photo taken outside the courthouse on that memorable day. In the picture, he stood with the Riverdale residents still holding Mrs. Betty's pie, smiling not like the legal prodigy who had just won an impossible case, but like the 18-year-old kid he still was at heart. His phone rang again. Another community in need of help. Jake grabbed his manila folder, still as simple and worn as the day he'd walked into Judge Henderson's courtroom and headed out to change another community's life. Some things, he thought as he locked his office door, were worth more than money or prestige. Sometimes the best victories were the ones that helped regular people sleep better at night, knowing their water was safe and their voices had been heard. And sometimes, the most important thing a lawyer could do was show up, prepared and passionate, regardless of what others might think about the way he looked or how old he was.